Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight is our regular Sunday night meeting for Bucky-inspired comprehensivity to understand and change the world. And what we're doing this evening is something called Lightning Talks, where people can share their thoughts or ideas about what they've learned about Buckminster Fuller. Some people may know more than others, but in order to get started, you can start by typing exclamation point in the chat. You don't need to be an expert. You can talk about if you've been here over the past, say, I don't know, I think it's about 12 weeks. If anybody would like to go ahead and share it, go ahead and type exclamation point in the chat and we can get started. Evanique, thank you.
You're welcome. Hi, everybody. So I will say that I want to say that I am new to Buckminster Fuller, but based off of what Strippy gave me last week on the meetup last week, uh, he told me I can no longer say that because he says that I am in the middle because I'm learning about Bucky. So um, I think for those of you who've heard me speak before, you know that I I just started studying Bucky about December of last year. I participated in a couple of Comprehensivist Wednesdays. Um, I've heard CJ talk about it. And as I said before, I really didn't get it, and I started in January with Struby and learning about things such as the four eyes. And the thing that I love about what Shrupi does is that he plays. He plays with different tetrahedrons and octahedrons, and he uses different shapes and he makes them. And so it allows you to see it from the four eye. He calls it the four eyes and the eight eyes, and he shows you through play how he does that and how he sees it. And what it does is it allows people to play with ideas, to play with things, but not just for the sake of play, which would be enough, but it's for the sake of seeing what you can contribute to the world. And I think that's the thing that I'm pulling away from Bucky Fuller's meetup, well, from Bucky Fuller and from studying Bucky, is that it's about what you can contribute to the world. It doesn't, not to say that it doesn't matter, it does, but it's not just about like trying to figure out everything that Bucky is doing or trying to fully understand Bucky, because I know when people give talks like Kurt McNamara and other people, D.W. Jacobs, and all these people that some of whom have met Bucky and some of whom have known Bucky for years, and and do different things with his ideas. It's about what you can bring to the table for the world, and that's what I think Bucky sees is like these things that Bucky was looking at is how to better the world that we're in right now and how to apply these ideas to the world that we're in. And it was Strippy when he was doing um meetups and he was talking about the tetrahedrons. He was saying he uses them in different areas of his life. Um and that, the thing I got from him is that he's very minimalist and he's very, environmentally conscious, and he lives by that. Like he lives by that, and he uses these tetrahedrons and octahedrons and all of these things to build structures that are stable and that are environmentally friendly for him. He mentioned in the last, I think it was either in the second or the last talk that he did about, he did a structure where it looked like a cube, but it had like a cross, like a X. And he was like, this is how you stabilize this. It's not the square doesn't stabilize it. It's the I think he said it's the four eyes that stabilize it. And he showed how. And that, he had built certain structures. Like I know one time he told us that he built a bed that was structured, and he's looking at building different things in his life that are structured. Another great person was Tom Miller when he showed us his apartment and how he could fit several people and have them spend the night and be comfortable in a little apartment in New York City. And that was just amazing to me because I'm like, how do you do that? Well, he showed us, and it was just amazing how he lives minimally. And he was showing, how you could take that structure and take it into a world, and you could possibly, you know, um, sharply reduce, homelessness, um, and how you could preserve energy. And I think that's the thing that I'm getting from Bucky, from studying Bucky here at 52 Living Ideas, is I'm getting that, this work can have an impact on the world. It can have a real impact on the world right now. That's what Bucky looked at. It wasn't like some future state. Although that's part of it, I don't want to misspeak, but it's kind of like you can have an impact now and in the future if you just try. And I think that's the beauty of studying Bucky, is that you can try to solve problems that seem to be insolvable. And I noticed that from different speakers here at all different types of meetups that are here that we have been studying over the past 3 months. Cherie Kant has had different type of speakers come in, and they show you what they do in the world. John and Yoshimi saw how they used Bucky ideas to impact the business world and have people work together to come together for a goal. Um, D.W. Jacobs show how you can use Bucky ideas in theater. Bucky loved theater, and I love that Bucky was a polymath. Like he had so many different interests. It was not mutually exclusive. As in fact, um, I think the book that I read was Operation Spaceship Earth. You could see a literary quality to Bucky reading that book, and I was just like enthralled. And I know we had read it for in the beginning, so for me, the impact that it's had is that I can see um, the impact it can have on the world when you study these things and you open your mind to different ways of thought, and you also open your mind to difficult topics. Um, Opening your mind to difficult topics that you don't fully understand, and you think, "Oh, I'm lost." You're not lost. You're learning, and that's my takeaway.
So thank you. I thank you very much, Ebonique. So what we'll do is we'll go to each person that has a talk, and then we'll go ahead and make comments. Technically, I'm supposed to hold everybody to 5 minutes this evening. I let Ebonique go a little bit longer. She's often a co-host here, and but that doesn't necessarily matter. And since we have so few speakers, that I think it would be it's okay to go a little bit over the normal 5 minute limit. So if anybody else has a talk that they would like to share, go ahead and type exclamation point in the chat. I don't know if I see Jeannie here. Jeannie, would you like to? I see you unmuted. I know. Okay. Nobody else wants to share. All right. So
yes, I do want to
oh,
share.
okay.
Sorry, I was trying. I couldn't even type exclamation point. I was getting comma. But
no problem. Go right ahead.
Can you see me as well?
I can't actually. So if you could.
Oh, that's going to really ruin my presentation because I have visuals.
Oh well.
Is there a special way I can turn my video on?
Yes, there should be a camera icon in the corner of your device, and it's like a little, it has a video, stop video or video.
Can you see me now?
No.
No, this is my first time doing Zoom. I'm so sorry.
No, no worries at all.
I'm
It's a
hitting that
button
little.
beside microphone. You have to see it. It looks
It's
like
right next
camera.
to the microphone. Just how you unmuted. Thank you for that, Ernest.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm unable to. I'm touching that little camera, but it's not changing anything.
Oh,
We can rely on your voice. So
wait, Joe, can she try one more thing?
What's that? What?
Um,
The share content is green, and I'm not really sharing content. So can I turn off the share content?
There you are.
wait,
Oh,
There you
I
are.
suddenly
you
went
are.
on. Okay, okay. So sorry, it's been very difficult for me to get into Zoom, but I wanted to talk about model thinking, since that was CJ's next his next big meetup that he was planning, and his next essay. So when we talk about model thinking, it's usually about bell curves and scatter graphs, where you have the rich and the poor and everybody in between, that kind of model. And then it's become more complex because it's all involved with computers. So the computers have these simulations, changing one little variable, they'll run the simulation, 1,000 years and see if that makes a difference. And, so you can make all kinds of really great models doing that. And that's basically the kind of techniques that are used in model thinking. But when I think of model thinking, I think of, polyhedral models like this. So these can be very handy, in terms of changing our thinking from being flat, which would be, like this, to a more three-dimensional kind of way of looking at things. So when you're making a decision, you might say yes and no, but there's also maybe. So when you have a tetrahedra, you can have room for the yes and the no and the maybe, and you can follow these different trails. You may follow a maybe and realize that you never even needed to ask this first question. Or there might be a question, is this true? I'm forgetting now, true or false. And then there's also unknown, maybe you can never know whether it's true or false. So you have a third possibility. CJ was actually, I've been reading through, his old works, and he was interested in having multiple choices for decisions way back when he was in high school. He was already talking about, changing it from just being so dualistic. And it's natural for us to be dualistic because, we are bisymmetrical like this. So it's natural for us to think like this. And we're trying to decide to do something, we'll put the pros and the cons. But when you change it to a three-dimensional model, you really have a possibility of breaking out of that kind of thinking, and new ideas will appear. So I like the tetrahedrals, especially. Look at this. Can you guys all see this pretty well? Yeah. So if you were considering these two axes here, this pink one here and this pink one here, they're parallel and they never meet in a perfect tetrahedron, which this isn't. But you can think of, these are the opposites, but this one is, it's dualistically opposite. I mean, there's more to the opposite than just being face to face or something like this. So there's a way to start thinking and modeling your ideas, based on that. So I also played around with the octahedron, which was Shrikant's idea. And he had done this, and I was looking at it to kind of use this as your window or how you see through things. And I was really surprised when I actually started playing with it that that window could be this window or this window. I sort of saw it when he was doing it, but you have all kinds of different windows depending on your perspective that you can look at things. And you can have the opportunity of giving different properties to the different parts of the polyhedra, like, the vertices might have one kind of property, and the edges might have another kind of property, and the faces might have a third kind of property. So, you could say that the vertices would be, can I afford to do this? And the edges might be, will I be happy doing this? And then the faces might be, how is this affecting the world, or, the world outside me? So you've got three dynamics going on. And I just wanted to finish up by saying one thing about, polyhedra. Have I gone over 5 minutes?
Okay.
So
letting it go.
Bucky was standing on his Navy ship, and he was looking out, and he was seeing these bubbles, and, millions of them. And he said, how, to what decimal place does nature or God take pi in order to create a bubble? Because a bubble is spherical, you need the circle, which needs pi. Pi is a transcendental number that just keeps going. Nobody's found the end of it yet. And it just has so many decimal places, it just keeps going. And so he said, no, nature couldn't possibly use pi. And actually, if you think about it, there is probably not in nature ever a perfect sphere, and probably, if ever, even a perfect circle. Because if you take a sphere and you make all the different possible cuts through it, think of all of those would be a circle. How many of those are actually circles in reality? They're always going to be off. And we have gravity, which always pretty much guarantees that they're going to be off. But so when you think of your models, we're using the perfect shapes. They're not really perfect, but they're, in reality, these are in a dynamic, and they're changing all the time, and the angles are changing, and we can't keep up with it in our minds, but we can in our intuition. You can follow these lines even though you can't probably describe them mathematically. So I think part of the benefit of using models for thinking is that you can kind of just let your intuition roll along, the edges or the vertices, without actually, analyzing everything, especially not analyzing it in a mathematical way, which you end up with, tremendous formulas just to make a simple polyhedra. Okay, sorry I took so long.
That's quite all right, because I think that honestly, I am still timing it, believe it or not, and you're just at 6 minutes and 30 seconds. So 1 minute and 30 seconds over. That's hardly anything to worry about, especially when we don't have as many exclamation points in the chat. So Paul, I'll just give you an opportunity. We have gone around and a couple people have shared their thoughts. If anybody else would like to share their thoughts or give a lightning talk about what they've learned over the past 3 months, or 4 months at this point, or just share their thoughts on a specific topic about Buckminster Fuller or anything else. I'm not putting you out there, Paul. Not at all. Just
no. Thank you, Joe. I came on. I wanted to do. I'm so sorry I couldn't be here till 9:30. This was the earliest I could get here, and I have some little diagrams. I actually do want to show something and talk about something and share thoughts, but I need like 3 minutes to get my act together to get them where I can share them easily. We can share our screen in this situation?
I will enable that.
Okay, I need about 3 minutes, Joe, and then yes, I'd love to have a chance to talk.
Okay, so for 3 minutes, I could Evanique, would you like to give another talk?
No, just wanted to share something really quick that Jeannie said that like I just wanted to point out.
We'll do shares afterwards.
Oh, cool. All right.
But we'll wait for now.
All right.
Does anybody else have anything that they would like to share? Or any lightning talks? If not, I'll just talk about one of Buckminster Fuller's concepts myself, and I'll keep it to 3 minutes. If Paul, one of the ideas that is considered very powerful is the idea of something called trim tab. And actually, on his grave, Buckminster Fuller has the idea of trim tab. And so during World War II, he was employed by as a consultant for the Navy. And his job was essentially to improve the efficiency on ships. So he suggested that the Navy could increase their speed by adding a small metal wooden attachment to the rudder. And what this did is it reduced what is something called drag, and which it means it minimizes the resistance that's created for the ship to move through the water. And what this does is it actually improves the ability of the ship to with using its fuel. It basically doesn't consume as much energy. When the rudder in the trim tab moves in the opposite direction of the force that's being created against the rudder, it makes makes it easier for it to go through the water. One of the ideas is that this, and again, I'm just trying to think some of these things through. One of the ideas is that this is a metaphor as well as something that was actually done and put into practice as to how a little change in the world could have a big impact. And that's what it's about. So the idea he made little changes that had huge implications on systems. So Paul has typed exclamation point in the chat, and we've given him time to prepare his talk, which is good because I only had a few things to say about trim tab at this moment.
Okay, so can I share my screen, Joe?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, I'll try it in a minute here. So what I wanted to talk about is my ideas are not going to be anywhere near as sort of complicated as many that get presented in these wonderful talks. But one of my issues with this whole, making this whole world of geometric thinking, if you'll put it that way, accessible, is to simplify it. And I am very excited about pretty simple applications where you map vertices and tetrahedrons of tetrahedrons to concepts in the mental health space. This is all about the mental health space for me because I do counseling. And then I haven't done this yet. So I'm sharing with you guys very early thoughts, but actually being able to do something like this with clients, which is why I want to keep it, we're not going to do a lot of fancy 3D visualization. It's just, some might like it, but it's not a huge percentage. So, and it depends on what the issue is. So I'll give you how I mean. You've often heard me, if you guys heard me talk in other meetups about how can we make this usable because these are powerful ideas. So let's take someone who has agoraphobia. So they're afraid of crowds and social, just someone who's afraid of social situations and crowds. Let's just call it that. That's close enough to what this is. So we'll use that term, not even the technical term of any sort. So suppose you're trying to learn about the symptoms of the person. So what you might do, let me pull up the right one here. That's 9:15:1. These are just things I did by hand, and I took pictures with my phone. No 3D models here. You know, nothing to find, nothing to see here. Anyway, let's see if I can do this. Now I'm going to share one example. I'm going to my downloads folder, and then I'm going to find what I just downloaded, and it's that one, and I'm going to make it visible so that when I click my Zoom, you can see I'm talking through myself how to do this. And then I click share. There it is. Okay. So I hope you can see that at least a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, the person, when you talk to a person, what you do is one of the things you do in an assessment is just conversationally have them brainstorm about the symptoms they're having. Okay, so here's a set of symptoms, and this didn't come out the way I've put it here. The person said, "Well, I'll just hide. I'll stay inside, and then I'll keep thinking about everything, and then it'll make me anxious. But then I really want to get out of it, but I'm feeling stuck." So those are just keywords you're writing down. But the helpful part of this is after you've let them talk for a while, again, I haven't done this yet. And anyone who's a therapy person who's done something like this, chime in, please, is say, well, okay, let's draw this out in this way. So here's a picture for you. Where do you start? Where would you like to start? So you let the client decide where to start. Because we're going to talk through how you get into loops, basically, and how things reinforce each other. So where would you like to start? So the guy goes, I'm just picking any one. He goes, overthinking. This stuff, the fact that I can't do anything, I'm just constantly stressing and thinking over and over about it. So I might go, okay, and you will use the word stressing. So it sounds to me like we should draw an arrow between overthinking and anxious. And then he goes, yeah, and then I get more anxious. But then you know what happens. I think more about that. Okay, so now we see a little loop of just that line. And then what happens? Well, then I just go in my room and put my head under the blanket. I mean, these are literal things people say. They just stay in bed all day. This happens. This is not made up. And then you go, okay, and then what are you doing while you're lying in bed? Well, I'm just thinking about it all again. So now we can draw for the person. You're overthinking, you get anxious, it makes you, so I'm describing one face of the tetrahedron, the one that is outlined by overthinking, anxious, and hiding. I won't do every one of these because you can see that's how you can then go from that to, well, what if you notice that we could break that? If we break that at any point, it might break the whole cycle for you. And then you give the client the choice of where to break it. Now I'm using therapeutic techniques, but I'm applying them in the context of the tetrahedron when I talk about that. So now you get all these things and you have all these ideas, okay? So then you say to yourself, well, I'm an eclectic therapist. I could apply many different techniques to this guy. Which one should I use? Well, let's use the tetrahedron for that. Let's see if it'll help us figure out which one to use. So I'm going to find the right one for that. Yeah. So here's one. So I got to close this again. Share one more time. I have 3 of these, so I'll try to go through them as fast as I can. Share. So, okay, this is a different case. Suppose someone witnessed a police shooting. These are actually things that really happened, unfortunately. So you went through some things with the guy. You might have done what I'd call one could write a whole book, and you'd call that in the book the symptom tetrahedron. So now we're going to do a treatment modality tetrahedron. Well, we could use cognitive restructuring, narrative therapy, exposure therapy, or behavioral activation. But sometimes you need to use a combination. And you might want to say to yourself, well, this actually happened. The person is not ready for exposure therapy. That's where you go to places similar to what happened in you. The person's not ready for that. But they feel like they could start to think about how they think about it. So you might look at this with them. You could even look at this and say, why don't we start with this, cognitive restructuring? Because if we start with how you think about it, that might lead to, I'm going down to behavioral activation, some ways we could get you into thinking about some new behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to take much longer. I'm excited about this. This is a way you might use that. And I'm not saying that some rocket science Buckminster Fuller concept came out and changed the world, but that when you map things to a tetrahedron, new things occur to you. Many of you said that in these presentations, like you just get new ideas, man. And finally, one more. Suppose we decide to do cognitive behavioral therapy, on some person. So now let's look at a thing that's sort of more specific to that modality, and that'll be done. How am I doing for time, Joe? Do I have time for this one last one? I can't hear you, but I'll take 30 more seconds. So this is thoughts, feelings, and actions. That's how you talk about cognitive behavior therapy with kids. But we'll just say thought, emotion, and sensation. We're using those terms in this case. So I haven't drawn any arrows here, but you could just put this in front of a person and say, we choose where, and this is consciousness. We have thoughts, we have emotions, and we have body sensations. We can choose where we live because we can also create an observer that isn't any of those things, but can watch them. So there's my little presentation on how these concepts might help with mental health treatment, and I'm pretty excited. Thank you. Can't hear you, Joe.
Oops.
That was fantastic. I was just saying, so thank you for sharing. Would anybody else like to share a presentation on what they've learned over the past 4 months or anything? I see we have some new people that entered the room. So I want to give everyone an opportunity at least to give a 5-minute lightning talk. Okay. So it doesn't look like we have any other takers. Now we'll move on to comments about the 3 presentations that were presented this evening. I thought all 3 were very well done. Ebeneika, I know you had some comments that you were going to make, so you can go ahead and make those comments at the moment. No.
Yeah, mine's are going to be quick. I think the first one was with Jeannie when she showed the tetrahedron and she was showing, how to apply it to a practical question. Like, it's the pink ones where she was saying, do you what is the cost of doing, of taking the action, and then, is it something that you really want to do? And I think that's just, it was a beautiful way of showing how you can use principles like the tetrahedron and the octahedron to solve everyday problems and to look at it. You can use that model in so many different ways. And I think Johnny Yoshimi showed us that as well. how they use the model. And I think what Paul's presentation, his was absolutely fantastic. And I loved how he also uses it in psychology, because you can see when a person's ready to move on to a form of treatment. Um, you know, the example he gave about exposure therapy, and if that person, the model that he used was, is that person ready for exposure therapy, or is it too much? And then on the first model, I loved how he showed how you can use that model to break a cycle, and how the person was an overthinker. And then, you know, what does that person do? Practically, that person goes home and lays in bed. Like, they just overwhelmed. And he showed how you could just, you could use that model to show the person how they could break the cycle. So I think, you know, I agree with him in that you can use these principles and these ideas and come up with new ideas of your own. And I think that's just the beauty of Bucky overall, is that you can use these principles to come up with some great ideas of your own. It helps you think more. It also helps you not overthink it. Um, Ironically enough, like, you could come up with solutions, but the only way you could do that is by taking action. So in a very real sense, these ideas say take action, try it. If it doesn't work, try again. Um, so I that's what I got from both presentations.
Thank you, Evanique. Would anybody else like to share? I actually can share some comments on what you had said, and but I would like to give everybody else an opportunity first to share their takeaways from the three presentations. What I will say is that there were obviously connections between all three presentations. And some of those obvious connections were when I was thinking about it, was when it had come to spherical thinking, is what you started with, Evanique. And one of the primary concepts is seeing the interconnectedness of things. And that's one of the things that Bucky focuses on. And you were talking about it within the terms of Struppi, not necessarily taking a linear approach to problems and thinking about it very narrowly. So spherical thinking really involves seeing how to solve a problem from like multiple perspectives, and that's the four eyes that essentially was being mentioned by Struppi. It's understanding how different factors can impact a decision. So it's you know, it's something that's obviously used in design thinking. It's used in engineering. It's used in and Buckminster Fuller thought we could use it with technology in order to solve the world's problems. And so that spherical thinking is very much connected to what we saw with Jeannie's presentation. Jeannie essentially talked about the polyhedra, which is, you know, a three-dimensional model, which is made up of essentially faces, edges, and vertices, and how those things then how they connect to each other. And what Jeannie provided us with is a physical presentation. You also went over what the tetrahedron was like, which is actually also a three-dimensional object, which is made up of four edges, four triangular faces, four edges, and
6 edges.
4 vertices, and six edges. You're right, 6 edges and 4 vertices, right? And these are some of the building blocks that we can use for the way Paul had actually put as an example. And how do we look at our thinking? And I very much appreciated what Paul did with both of the slides, actually. When you're talking about, I'm just looking back at what you exactly presented, so I don't necessarily, I really like the last one when you're talking about consciousness. And immediately I actually thought about how that could be related to chapter 13 of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, I'm not ready to give a full analysis of that, but it does talk about the idea of the observer and how the observer actually works in, and how thought works in, and sensations. But that's an interesting way to look at consciousness. And you can see the connections to what it means to be self-aware. So that's a very powerful tool in order to kind of bring into an idea that is very difficult to understand. It's very, it's a kind of a graphical way of thinking about things, and it makes things so much easier. Let's see. I also liked the cognitive restructuring and the behavioral action activation and nature. And as far as exposure therapy and using the analogy of a police shooting.
This is the first place where.
Oh, sorry. So, but what you saw between all three presentations is essentially a way of thinking about the world. And that is what Buckminster Fuller really was about, is about solving the world's problems using systems thinking. So those are just some of the things that I had seen, and I really appreciate the three presentations. Having you talk about spherical thinking, Avanik, Jeannie showing us the model and talking about the connections, and Paul talking about the practical, some of the more practical applications that he's actually using when it comes to making connections between ideas. And that is one of the most powerful things that I've kind of come across with Buckminster Fuller. It's when you can when you read enough of his materials and you see enough of the presentations that have been provided to us so graciously by many of the presenters here, Stroopy, Kirby Erner, Doug, Peter Meissen, and I don't want to leave anybody out. McNamara. I mean, it would be rude, but everybody has done a fabulous job. But what they're giving us is a model to how to think about the world, and that was what actually CJ had given me. So in a way, they're just coming together now in a way that's allowing us all to benefit from their knowledge, which is very very kind. So anybody else have any comments? Go ahead, Jeannie, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to tap, exclamation point, and I could not do it. But I think I had wanted to talk more about the great things about model thinking using polyhedra. But what Paul brought a couple of them to mind that I think illustrated so very well. One of them is that and it also relates to spherical, because you're going around and around and around, and each time you're making a choice. If you make the same choice every time in the octahedra, at least, you'll end up going just in a square. and that's flat. So one of the things you'd want to do perhaps is when you get to a place where you're making a choice, this time I'm going to do it slightly differently. And that will put you off on a different path. And I think one of the things too, it shows with his model, you're not going to take a patient and put them through that one time. No, it's like circular again and again. I mean, sometimes these people have to go for years and basically are making the same steps again and again. You can do that very well with a polyhedra because you're going around and around. And you've been here before, but maybe you're going to try it a little differently this time. And you've been here before. So, life is really like that. You get up in the morning, you eat breakfast. It's all the same thing again and again. We are in a kind of a circular mode that our lives live in a circular mode. And you can also think of it as a spiral if you're trying to think of where you're trying to get. Yeah, Joe was thinking that. But each time you came around, maybe it's not quite the same. So the patient maybe has been there before, but this time it's going to be a little different. So you can also kind of make a spiral around on your polyhedra that you can end up really where you want to be or progressing. And I think, we would like to think that our lives are not just, totally a repeat of every day of the same thing we did yesterday, that we're somehow, making some kind of dynamic change in some kind of direction.
Yeah, thank you for so much for that, Jeannie. I mean, I very much appreciated the spiral, and I think you captured what comprehensivism is with the decision that you're making the same decision on the top, thinking just as about things, making the same decision over and over and over again, so that it's really fascinating in the sense that one of the things about comprehensive thinking is essentially not looking at things in one dimensions and just how we can make those connections and come to some solution. So immediately I thought of John and Yoshimi's approach. And when you mentioned the spiral and going around, I would actually just drawn a spiral right at that particular moment. And their model, which I actually have up, it's, they use nature and, as the idea of water unifies, fire energizes, earth solidifies, and air transforms. And they map those things to how people interact with one another. So having those connections, and we don't necessarily just interact with each other, obviously, in a linear way. It's kind of an ongoing process. And that's how things in physics actually work as well. I mean, in addition to, these thoughts are actually rooted in nature. The one thing I did want to just introduce as maybe an example that I thought about. Well, actually, I'll hold off on that. I see we have Paul and Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie, for those comments, because every time I look at this, I think of new ways to do it. But one of the things related to your points you guys are talking about is I just went through actually training in prolonged exposure therapy, but there you use this thing called a SUD scale, that subjective units of distress. So every time they go to the mall, which is a highly stressful place for them, they rate how the SUDS was for them, or when they're talking through the experience, what the number is. But that makes me think, and I'm curious about people who've used tetrahedra for modeling and things, that I want to make each vertex, like I'm looking at my agoraphobia thing with anxious, stuck, hiding, overthinking. And I'd like the person every appointment, because they're going to keep doing those loops. We're not going to, as Jeannie said, is to show the heat of it, like a heat level, 0 to 100. So you're making each vertex have a kind of a size or a rating or a color. I'd be interested in any thoughts on that, to add that dimension of a quantitative level indicated of the size of each vertex. Any thoughts? I need to map, the crowd here. We're crowdsourcing the knowledge to build this therapy out of tetrahedral thinking.
I'm going to let Mike go first. Just actually one point of clarification. What's in the middle of I didn't catch what's in the middle of the overthinking, feeling stuck.
So the middle is hiding. So on the top is overthinking, left is feeling stuck, right is anxious, and the middle is hiding. But that's really, there's just the top point of the tetrahedron when it's positioned a certain way, because I'm just doing a 3D in drawing, in 2D. But so those are the four: overthinking, hiding, feeling stuck, and anxious. They're all symptoms.
And how they interact with one another.
Right.
I'll go first, but I'm going to think about that while Mike goes ahead and speaks. Mike, you're on mute.
Okay. Overthinking, I think, is good, but you need a formal way of overthinking something so that you can parse the results into something useful. And we had a guy, when we talked about applying these concepts, some guy came over and only showed up once. He was kind of a political scientist and wanted a method, wanted to try and use these tetrahedron spherical thinking things to parse some of his data. And we never got the loop closed, and I'm not sure, but what he was trying to do with that discussion, I think you were there, Paul, when that guy showed up. It was one of these Sunday afternoon things. And I know Joe was there. We never did get closure on that. But at any rate, when you're trying to evaluate something, they tell you need to look at both sides of every issue. And this is that kind of situation where there's there's a complexity of many factors. So you got to look at all sides of every issue. Now, in artificial intelligence type things, they use something similar to an issue, and then two or three choices, and each of the lines of that tetrahedron represents a probability and a set of conditions under which that piece of logic is true. So that is kind of the way ChatGPT works. And they figure what would be the next possible word to follow it. And they come up chaining these together to build sentences. Now, they're not using the tetrahedron concept directly. But you probably, some of you have probably found that certain problems that you have, if you solve them in rectangular coordinates, you get it's difficult, and you have discontinuities. If you if you put them in circular coordinates or spherical coordinates, the problem emerges and it becomes tractable. Now, these things, let's hold that thought for a minute. That we can work in spherical coordinates. Now, what Bucky came up with is the Dymaxion theory, which he talks about in several of his books, of how to tie tetrahedrons together to do something like, and I guess from where you are, to try and add the logical flow of multiple entries in the DSM-5 together. And if you just take one of them, you can convince the person that he has 392.60 or something, and he's an OCD, and you should put him on this kind of psychoactive drug. But you get a situation where you can convince, you pick any of those, and you can come up with a reason they should be on that particular diagnosis. So what do you do with that? You go through several of those diagnoses and decide which one is most likely. And there isn't a formal way of doing it. Now, Bucky realized that, and that's why his tetrahedrons were a way of tying them together, of formally of doing those things. And then there's since 3 is maybe not enough, but 3 is good. 3 is better than a scalar of saying it's either true or false. But that there's just one of them with that there's 3 choices with a probability attached to each one, and a list of conditions where that doesn't explode into because of nonlinearities. Now, the Dymaxion thing allows, in Bucky's paradigm, a way of tying tetrahedrons together. And he's made some fairly complicated maps in some of his papers of how he's tied tetrahedrons together to make analyses. Now, even though I only had a comment, not rather than a cohesive presentation, I probably used my 5 minutes already, my little clock says. So, and I see other hands smiling and saying they got something to say. So I'll say over and out.
Okay. Yeah. So I can kind of see the spiral with the overthinking, the feeling stuck. Now I kind of have it drawn out a little bit more. I'll defer to Jeannie and Bill first, and then we'll kind of go from there. If that's okay. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, actually, I had a second lightning talk, but are you ready for it, or would we rather discuss these?
You know what, Bill,
maybe Bill has something to say.
Are your comments related to what we've been discussing, or is it a lightning talk onto itself, or
it was unto itself?
Okay. So you're okay. So Bill, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks. I want to address what Paul just talked about maybe 8 minutes ago. Paul, can I ask you first to just restate those 4 words?
The overthink.
Sure. One of the, you mean for my symptoms tetrahedron?
Yes.
Yeah, overthinking. And remember another thing I want to point out before I say this is, to Mike's point, we're talking about what the client reports is problematic. Actually, we're using his words. So we're not being technical here. The client used the word overthink. I overthink. Okay. I hiding, that's numbers 2. I feel stuck. Again, these are the client's words. Symptom number 3. And that's the most important thing to do is listen to the client. And then 4 is anxious. I feel anxious. And those made up 4 points of the tetrahedron, right?
Okay. I'm going to use 4 synonyms of those 4 words to make my point.
Okay.
For overthinking, the synonym I'm going to use is obsessing. For anxiety, the synonym I'm going to use is distrust. And then, what was the third word again?
Feeling
Hiding.
stuck.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, feeling stuck.
Oh,
Hiding.
right, paralysis.
Hiding.
Feeling stuck.
So hiding's the second.
The synonym I'm going to use for feeling stuck is paralysis.
Okay.
And then the synonym that I'm going to use for hiding is over controlling. Hiding is one form of over controlling. It's over controlling, one's activities or which other people in the world can see oneself. There's many forms of over controlling. So those are my synonyms. And I'm going to talk about the dichotomy between paralysis and flow and the journey from paralysis back to flow. Could be in an individual, it could be in a group. Things that are paralyzing are distrust, obsessing, and hiding. Those things can be paralyzing. So I'm going to couch this in terms of a tetrahedron in the following way. Imagine a small triangle and then a larger triangle below it. Imagine the small triangle collapses into a single point. Then we've got a single point and a larger triangle below it. What's that, a pyramid? Geometry people, help me out.
Yeah. Right.
That's a pyramid?
Sounds like a pyramid. If it's a 1 point and a 3 points, no, it's a tetrahedron again.
Okay, so the upper small triangle collapsed, we imagine it's collapsed into a single point, and then we've got the lower triangle that's still a triangle. So we've got a single point and a triangle. Is that a tetrahedron?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's how I'm going to couch all that I'm about to say in terms of this tetrahedron. So imagine there's 4 triangles stacked on top of each other in the human body, okay? There's one triangle for the thoughts, another triangle for the feelings in the torso, a third triangle for the legwork, going and getting one's job done during one's day or, shopping. And the fourth triangle, all the way at the bottom, is the outcomes of one's actions. So the first triangle is thoughts, next one's feelings, third one is actions, and the fourth one is outcomes of one's actions. So in paralysis, one is in, each of those triangles is in a state of obsession, control, distrust, and obsession. But then through whatever it may be, meditation, prayer, what have you, it flips from control, distrust, and obsession to surrender, trust, and devotion. And then that triangle of paralysis collapses into a single point and drops down into the next level and transforms that level from paralysis to flow by transforming control, distrust, and obsession into surrender, trust, and devotion. And then that collapses into a single point and drops down into the next, et cetera, et cetera. This is a neurological roadmap for how a person transitions from anxiety to trust, from paralysis to flow, from obsession to devotion, to whatever, to their own needs, to their own natural flow of things. So I'll close up this schematic presentation of the tetrahedron version of the journey from paralysis to flow by saying that all that I've described to you is the result of 24 and a half years of Buddhist style mindful meditation practice that have taught me the way that the neurological system transitions from paralysis to flow. And it just so happens that there's the roadmap that I've just given exists in at least 3 major spiritual traditions for thousands of years. The yogic tradition has the chakra map of the neurological system, which basically is I've described in using different words. The Buddhist tradition has the map of the neurological system called the 12 links of dependent arising, which is all the uncomfortable feelings of control, distrust, and obsession. And then the Buddhist tradition has the 12 links of transcendental arising, which is all the other things, the surrender, the trust, the devotion to flow, etc. And then the Jewish tradition has the tree of life roadmap of the neurological system. So it can all be translated into the tetrahedron framework that I've just outlined. And it kind of accesses what you were talking about, Paul, because I was using synonyms for what you were talking about. And the kind of the modality that gets a person from paralysis to flow, it could be therapy, it could be prayer, it could be meditation, some kind of relationship that gets things flowing, gets, like in therapy, words flow that carry with them the anxiety and get heard by the therapist, etc. Or prayer or meditation that gets these realities into awareness and gets them heard. So that's my riff on what you're talking about. I hope it helps. Thanks for listening.
Oh, thanks for the presentation. Very good. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you're able to map all those, you know, and could you actually just give me the four that you were talking about with action, outcomes? What was it? The first two?
Oh, the 4 levels?
Yeah.
Okay. Thoughts,
Yeah.
feelings,
Okay. Feelings is the one I was missing. All right. Thank you.
actions, and outcomes of actions. Or to use different synonyms, thoughts are the head work, feelings are the heart work, actions are the leg work, and the outcomes of one's actions are, I don't know what you call it, the humility work, the equanimity work, what have you. Or relationship work. Outcomes of one's actions will be relationship work, because one cannot always control how other people respond to one's actions. So that would be relationship work. Yeah.
So I think that this is actually interesting, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because what you just did is you've taken your knowledge of Buddhism, Judaism, as well as Hinduism, and these traditions, and you're able to apply the tetrahedron. And this is what Bucky was really all about, is that you can start to put these thoughts together, and what you knew intuitively can be put on a graph. And it goes back to what Mike was talking about, is that you assign these probabilities to what best interacts with what. And then you have these nodes that actually interact with each other, and you kind of see how things, I would say solidify in a way. That's what maybe John and Yoshimi would use as a word, but it's the fact that you can actually take these ideas and see how they exist in geometry, as well as our intuition and what we've actually written down over thousands of years. And so those connections that you put together are the beauty of the tetrahedron. I mean, and did it very quickly as well. So that was pretty cool.
Can I add something?
Please.
More briefly this time.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Inspired by what you said. So there's actually a neurological foundation to this triangle tetrahedron structure, based on the fact that the right brain, there's a division of labor between the right brain and the left brain. The right brain is the place, neuroscientists have shown, it's the place where emotion and shapes and smells transpire, things that have no time structure to them. A shape is what it is, no matter how long you look at it. A smell is what it is, no matter how long you smell it. An emotion is what it is, no matter how long you feel it. Whereas the right brain is where things like trust and distrust, anxiety and its opposite of equanimity happen. The left brain is where things that have a time structure to them happen, like obsessing or devoting to a to-do list that has a sequence in time. The opposite of obsessing is a left brain thing. It's thought and analysis, etc., about the future and what I need to do now about the future. Whereas devotion also has a time structure to it, a to-do list, devoting to a to-do list that has a sequence to it. It's more analytical and logical, whereas the right brain is more emotional and visceral. And so those are 2 points of a triangle. And the idea that flow happens from the top down, from one level of the body to the next, kind of it accesses that division of labor between right and left. And it's got a nested structure to it, from thoughts to feelings to actions, etc., which is what produces the tetrahedron. So yeah, thanks for letting me riff on about that for a little bit.
Appreciate it. No, I appreciate the comments. No, I think that that was very well said, very well put together. And again, I think that this is something that and I like how you use the term division of labor between those two. But in terms of systems and seeing how they interact with one another, just the way you put that together, I think that, again, that's a model that you can start to see, and you would see where things don't work as well, right? If, let's just say that some of the things that you had shared necessarily didn't work logically, or you could test them, then you would actually know. You would have a model to actually test some of your ideas. And I believe this is actually something that Fuller would talk about, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeannie, the idea of leaky edges. So the idea of leaky edges is essentially like a graph, and how these things interrelate to one another. And again, this goes back to what Mike was saying with even probabilistic thinking that we can add to that. And so again, I think what was interesting is that Bill did very quickly, as he put in intuition, and actually that's kind of a way of thinking as well, is he mapped intuition and rational thinking. and so basically what people knew intuitively, we're now thinking about more rationally and analytically, I would say, in a way. So that was well done, Bill. Thank you. So I think we had, I think we didn't have any other hands up, or yeah, Jeannie, actually, so do you want to give your second lightning talk?
Try. Let me see if I can. Oh gosh. Sorry, I'm not good at this.
That's okay.
All right. Can everybody see me?
Yep.
And hear me? Okay. The second lightning talk, I mean, I had planned these so long ago, but anyway, it's been something, brewing in my mind for a while. And I wanted to talk about precession as a tool for social change. And I wanted to first, I mean, I know you guys have heard a lot about the, well, maybe I can't. I had written down the dictionary definition of precession, but basically you're thinking of an object, and the object is rotating. And so in physics, when you're thinking of a rotating object, you generally just think of the axis, because it's all too complex if you think of anything else. And you think of it as a rigid body, because if you think of it as flowing, it starts getting very complex, and some things are dragging behind. And so anyway, you think of it as a solid object, and it's rotating, and you think of the axis. And what happens is you have the axis and you apply force, but the force doesn't go in the direction that you're applying. Instead, you're actually adding your force to the force of the spinning object, and the force flies off in a direction that's perpendicular to what you put in. So in other words, you're pushing, but it's going in some other direction, depending on the spin of this thing. So I made a little picture here of a spinning cone. This is basically the model. And I was thinking this is good as our society, or the progress of humankind through time. And you could think of it either as the growth of population. There was so small here and a large one here, or you could think of it as progress. We had to work with stone tools, and now we have computers and supercomputers and satellites and so forth. or you could think of it in terms of our impact on the world. You know, where when we were first Adam, you know, we didn't make much change in the world, but now we're sort of like this. The changes that we've made are almost unbelievable in terms of, you know, killing off other species. So I like to think of this you know, cone kind of, we're out of kilter, you know, so we're like this. Now, your thought would be like, well, we just got to push ourselves back up. You know, we just have to get down here underneath and push this thing back up till it's straight again. Or some people will say, yeah, we could just wait for nature to make it straight like this. But I think if, you know, we can wait for nature, and nature probably will work it all out. But in the meantime, you know, we've lost so many species. I think we probably should do something about the situation that we're in. So what happens with this this thing is that we're in order to get it to go back to straight, you don't work like this. You don't have to hit your head against the glass ceiling. You don't have to, you know, push against unbelievable odds. You know, you can actually make a direction like this. It's used with this, and the thing will right itself. So this it's a way of thinking of how you can do something using the forces that exist in order to make things better, rather than fighting and just mostly losing. So I was thinking of it like this, you know, when Adam was here, if he hadn't messed things up, you know, if he had just left it the way it was, you know, he's probably the one that did this to us. You know, he for some reason he screwed up, and he made us ever since, you know, war and, you know, killing things unnecessarily, and, you know, destruction, and yeah, we just haven't behaved right. So you get up here, you know, and you can have one person that does something, you know, maybe Jesus or Aquinas or something, and their effect could be so, well, actually, okay, I got to do it the right way. They're going like this, and it's coming like this. So, you know, their effect could be great. You get up here where Bucky Fuller said one person can do all this, you know, all it takes is one person. And perhaps he was right. And, but I think not. And I think we've gotten up here to the point that I don't think one person can do it anymore. I don't think one person, you know, banging at this can make the difference. But I think that the point being that if a bunch of people do it, and one of the great things about what CJ was willing to do, he wasn't a megalomaniac thinking about, you know, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to do everything. He was working with something that was already established to kind of, you know, further it. And I think if you join together, you know, we have much more impact up at this point. I think it's, you know, with just the number of people on Earth, the mess we're in, I don't think one person can do it. But I think if one person leads other people to do, you know, to join in, I think we could probably, you know, make some kind of processional effect that would actually improve our situation here on Earth. So that was my thought on precession.
Very well done. And I think that you know, the example of the bumblebee is used with Fuller, and how the bumblebee doesn't even know necessarily what the changes that it's actually making sometimes. But I do believe, yes, you're right. How we use force and how we use leverage actually can lead to big changes. And that's kind of where I was going with TrimTab a little bit earlier, is how, you know, this little device actually essentially made the entire ship more efficient. And essentially, you were saying something like, as maybe it takes not just one individual, maybe it's an entire group. But that group albeit a small group, can have a huge impact on a system. And I think that, go ahead, would you?
I think actually that trim tab is a local example of
Exactly.
the force of precession.
Thank you. It is a, yes. It's a micro incisive in its sense. Yes, I thank you very much for saying that. And I think that while groups sometimes can have obviously a bigger impact, sometimes decisions can have a really big impact, even if it's done by a group. But I mean, but even as an individual, they can have a huge so let's just say, and I'm thinking of this in terms of, let's just say, like regulation or things along those lines. Maybe it may be a small group that makes a decision, but it has a huge impact on the way we function in the world. And so that would be maybe an example of from a more macro perspective. But again, I do think that also I'm thinking in terms of an example that I was just we can make decisions that actually go the wrong way as well, but while we're intending to do good. So that's the importance of system thinkings within that. So one of the things that I was thinking about, and I had a conversation recently, we had talked about is how one small decision trying to correct one problem can create a bigger problem if we don't necessarily, if we only think locally and we don't necessarily think comprehensively. So the example I was coming across was there was an author that had made very good points about some of the failures of our policies that we have in as far as addressing impoverished people. And one of the things he was trying to do was trying to reduce the fees that people have to pay for maybe overdrafting on their accounts. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. But one of the things he also complained about was the idea of small institutions not existing anymore, community banks, which is very true. But what happens with community banks is that community banks are the ones that sometimes they live off of those fees one way or the other. So while those fees are a problem, the other problem with the community banks, there's another problem as well, is that if you only have big lenders, then small businesses don't get loans. And if small businesses don't get loans, then you also have big employers, and big employers can suppress wages. What I'm saying is, in a sense, that certain decisions that we make, we have to think about the systemic implications of how they interact. And that's one of those small decisions that you can make that can go wrong, maybe, because you could actually have, a cascading effect while you're trying to do a good thing. What I'm trying to highlight more than anything is it's the importance of actually thinking in terms and systems as opposed to thinking in just in terms of just from a micro perspective, just in terms of problems and one-dimensional thinking. So that would be my kind of thought, is that how we start to think about the spiral effect of the impacts of the decisions that we're making. That's just a thought. It's maybe not the best example for possession, but I do think that trim tab actually is a good example of the micro incisive aspect of procession, of how to use force. And then you'd have generalized principles about whether it be energy, gravity, and things along those lines that you could apply and then essentially come up with a solution. So those are just some thoughts, really quickly. But I appreciate that very much. So, does anybody else have any comments? Thank you, Jeannie. Any other comments at all? Paul? I think you're on mute, Paul.
I'm on mute. I could put up one more tetrahedral example that builds on Bill's points if we want to go there. I don't know. Do we want to go there?
Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
Okay. I think we owe a certain person a fairly big debt, and I'll be curious what Bill thinks about this, but can I share my screen again here? Yeah, okay. I'm lucky that I got into the mental health field at a time, the way I look at it, when the concepts that Bill talked about kind of made it into the mainstream of evidence-based practices for mental health. Probably not to Bill's satisfaction, but to some degree. And I'm mainly talking about the starting point of that being Marsha Linehan, this suicidal person who was locked up quite a few times. And she was basically saved by Buddhism, in her own words. And she built a therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, and it incorporates those concepts, not in exactly the way Bill described, but what I wanted to mention related to it. So here's one example of how it's often presented. So there's 4 areas. And what I love about it, related to both Bucky and the concepts that we talk about all the time with yin and yang and chaos and order, she actually built a concept that there's this dialectic between accepting what is and wanting to change. And it's normal and it's part of life. And I'm sure Bill would have another way of talking about it in terms of flow and release and stress and paralysis. But and she took a lot from Thich Nhat Hanh, I think his name is, the Vietnamese monk, in her work. And mindfulness is actually a vastly overused term, but it's building on concepts of meditation from Buddhism. And but that's part of the two. Mindfulness and distress tolerance are the two that are focused on acceptance. But you don't just say, I'm going to accept everything. You want to change yourself. You want to change the world. And to do that, you need to regulate your emotions and you need interpersonal effectiveness. So that's one way of looking at it. So my quick thought to show you, well, what if we put those things in a tetrahedron? It's just like a brainstorming technique, right? So how does that look? How does that look? Oh, I just did it, but where is it? You can easily imagine how it looks. Have I shared it properly? I should have shared it properly. Just give me 1 minute. You can see what it's going to look like, but then we can talk about it for a minute. Here, it'll only take a second here. Gmail, apologize. Here it is. Download it and share it. Bring it up, share it. Yeah. So what if we, instead of doing it that other diagrammatic way, we just brainstorm it out and go, well, let's make those all 4 points of a tetrahedron, just to see what happens. But I immediately gain something from it. I gain thoughts about the order in which I might present things to a client. The client might gain thoughts about how, if you draw the vectors and make them into vectors with arrows between them, how the one thing influences the other. But this beauty of a tetrahedron is that all the points are interconnected. So everything's influencing everything. And it needs to be stressed to the client that, and a lot of what I talked about, Bill, I think before you came, I put up one about CBT with the equivalent of thoughts, feelings, actions, but the addition of the observer as the fourth point of the tetrahedron. But the important thing I work on a lot is accessibility to a person who's not deep into math and geometry of these thoughts. But you can see how you could gain fruit by looking at each faces of these, how each threesome creates a set of things, and how someone might feel weakness in one area and they could see it from this. So there's my quick additional thought, building on concepts of also order chaos, Buckminster Fuller's bridge, the suspension bridge, that's like acceptance change. It's all here to be talked about.
Awesome. You know, again, I really, you can see so many different connections here. And again, it very much similar to, you know, when we were talking about with John and Yoshimi's four triangles that they used. And actually, what we were talking, the idea of the jitterbug, I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, too, the idea how a system folds in to a triangle. To a single point, and how those all relate to one another. I'm actually, yeah, I would, you can definitely see the interactions between, yeah, the mindfulness, the interpersonal effectiveness, and the emotion regulation. Okay, and then you're looking at that, and you can almost map from there. You can see where the accept and change tolerance or accept and change aspect of things, and that actually is kind of related the way Bill was relating the right brain and left brain idea as well. So you can see how that actually fits in, and then you can go through each one of these categories and actually and map it in as well. I'm trying to think of what would be another example that would be good. I personally like the going through earlier, the observer and the thought. I'm thinking about how that does relate to the Bhagavad Gita, specifically that chapter 13. But yeah, if anybody has any comments other than maybe what I just added, is that as far as the how dialectical behavior therapy actually maps into the tetrahedron. Any thoughts? No. Go ahead, Ebony.
I don't have a thought, but I do have a question or an inquiry. And I guess the inquiry is, I've never heard of dialectical, the dialectical model before, but Joe was saying, just said that it links to the tetrahedron, and I'm trying to connect that in my brain. I don't know. I'm still not connecting how it
So
exactly
four
can.
categories essentially that Paul had shared. The idea
Yeah.
of you know, emotion regulation, mindfulness, and distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness, and how he mapped the distress tolerance to the top, and inside the emotional regulation, and then the mindfulness and the interpersonal effectiveness. That's kind of just like the 1, 2, 3, 4 method that actually that he used a little bit earlier with the overthinking, feeling hiding, feeling stuck, and anxiety that his client actually used as a model, or how they explain themselves. But it's interesting to see how these different therapies actually interact with one another.
Can I build on that a little, Joe?
Please, yeah.
Yeah. So, Ebony, this thing is highly, DBT, the dialectical behavioral therapy, is highly skills training oriented. So there's these giant books of ways to train your skills in each of these areas. So you might say with the person and say, you can just say simply, well, which should we work on and in what order? But this is a way to facilitate that. You say, maybe for the first 4 weeks, because of my interview with you and everything, we're going to concentrate on this face of the tetrahedron, which means we're going to work on distress tolerance and mindfulness with some emotional regulation, because your problems, person, are a lot related to acceptance. Oh, no, but then a different person, they're pretty good at accepting what is, but they're not so good at change. So for them, we're going to combine mindfulness, emotion regulation, and interpersonalness in terms of the interpersonal effectiveness, in terms of the order of practice. Like, let's do 2 weeks of these worksheets. They're about interpersonal effectiveness. So you can in a very concrete way, choose kind of the mix of skills you're trying to teach. And maybe, I'm brainstorming this out loud, I have never mapped DVT into a tetrahedron until tonight. So that's what this is about, But I'm looking at it and I'm saying, yeah, I could see doing that. I don't think it's like amazing, but it certainly isn't like a massive misfit. Like, why would anyone ever want to do that? It doesn't feel like that at all. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Also,
It does. Both of your explanations help me understand it better. Thank you.
It's also what is underneath these ideas that actually is the spiral that you're able to start to connect. And that's the most important thing when you start to think about it in geometric terms. You can kind of start to say, what is actually underneath here that makes sense? So in John and Yoshimi's model, it's the idea of they start with potential, and then they go to metaphors, and then how those metaphors interact with the relationships and how that actually works towards transformation. Well, what does that mean, right? So then you work back from there and work from underneath there. What is the potential that's actually even possible? What are the parameters about what's possible? And then they communicate through metaphors. And the metaphors kind of solidify the idea. And that's coming back to these ideas of nature that they use. So the energy is the potential energy that they're actually using. So then they have the metaphor that solidifies. And then they have the relationship that unifies, which is actually how things are interconnected. And then how the action itself transforms. And that's not totally just actually different than what actually Bill was just talking about not too long ago with the idea of what was the model with action, feelings, actions, outcomes, thoughts, feelings, actions, and outcomes, which is actually a really interesting model because, again, what are your thoughts? Your thoughts are potential, that's thinking, right? Then how do you, your feelings, metaphors are meant to actually connect with you by come up with ideas. Then you have your actions, which are your relationships in the model of John and Yoshimi. So those actions that you're actually taking and how you interact with everybody. And then those are actually the transformations that then occur from the outcomes so that you can start to see the model. But what does that all mean underneath that? Those start to be ideas that you can actually dissect. So Bill's model was very good, and I'm very much appreciative of you sharing of it. Because the idea of the thoughts, what types of thoughts are you having, positive or negative thoughts that actually you're trying to account for, the feelings that they are triggering within you, what is the perspective that you're taking, and that triggers something, right? It triggers an anxiety, it triggers, number of things. So then how do you change your thoughts? How do you change your language? How do you change what's underneath that to change the narrative? And then ultimately, that leads to an action, right? You're no longer in this paralyzed state, so to speak, because you've changed your perspective and how those thoughts interact with your feelings, because you're no longer feeling depressed, right? So you take action, right? You're kind of able to get unstuck, as Paul would have said under his model. And then, yeah, it gets to outcomes, right? So that's the kind of transformational aspect of things. But what, again, is what you start to see is you start to ask the questions that actually relate to one another. And it's extremely powerful when you're able to take these and make them generalized. Almost, they're not generalized principles, I don't want to overstate them, but they're ideas that allow you to drill down into something that's more concrete. And it starts to be able to think abstractly. And what this does with John and Yoshimi's model is it allows them to communicate with clients in a concrete way. And that's what actually starts to actually produce change. So then, that's just some thoughts. I know I mentioned a lot of stuff about your model up there, Bill. Maybe you can correct me if I misrepresented anything you said.
No, it sounded good. I wanted to ask Paul to name those 4 words from his DBT, which I missed because I was taking my 15-minute post-dinner walk in the park next door.
Oh, actually, I can name them for you. So they're actually mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotional regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. So, basically mindfulness actually is, if you drill down on it, it focuses on basically improving your ability to accept your present current state. So what is that? And then emotional regulation covers understanding and managing the change in intense emotions that you feel. Distress tolerance is essentially the strives to increase the tolerance of negative emotions rather than tying to escape from a problem. And interpersonal effectiveness, which actually I think is really obviously one of those important ones, consists of techniques to communicate with others that in a way that is assertive and maintains self-respect and strengthens relationships. No self without other kind of thing.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because I had an intuition that would fit into the nested triangle model, and it certainly does. So the mindful self-awareness, this is the triangle at the heart work, the emotional work. So I would say it's self-awareness, self-trust, self-discipline. I'm going to translate these into Paul's words in a minute. Self-awareness, self-trust, self-discipline, and self-acceptance. So the self-awareness is the mindful awareness that Paul talked about. Self-trust, I'll go back to in a minute. Self-discipline, self-restraint, that's distress tolerance. Instead of escaping, to use your word, Joseph, restraining the impulse to try to escape uncomfortable feelings. That's self-discipline. And then emotional regulation is the self-acceptance. Acceptance that one is feeling what one is feeling, and that the body has its own way of processing that. And all this translates into the 3 foundational words of surrender, trust, and devotion. So self-awareness is a surrender to being aware, instead of its opposite, which is controlling awareness away through denial of thoughts and feelings. To back up a second, each of these 3 words, surrender, trust, and devotion, has its opposite. The opposite of surrender is control. The opposite of trust is distrust. The opposite of devotion is obsession. So self-awareness is a surrender move, allowing oneself to be aware instead of remaining in ignorance of one's thoughts and feelings. Self-trust, self-love, really, is a trust move, which is the opposite of anxiety. It's kind of trusting that one's thoughts and feelings have their own logic, which one can learn and learn how to manage better. And then the self-restraint, distress tolerance, restraining the impulse to escape thoughts and feelings and just tolerating them instead of trying to escape them. That's a devotion. It's a devotion to self-discipline, self-restraint, etc. And then finally, the emotional regulation is another surrender move. Instead of trying to control one's feelings, learning how to channel them and accept that they flow in their way. And one can learn how to get into harmony with the way that they flow, which is, again, a surrender of control into more symbiosis. So the reason I'm doing this translation exercise to translate, Paul's 4 words from DBT into the language that I've been using is because it accesses your concept, Joseph, of like deeper underlying fundamental ideas. And the 3 building blocks are the surrender, trust, and devotion as opposites to control, distrust, and obsession. And flipping each of those triangles, flipping that triangle from control, distrust, and obsession to surrender, trust, and devotion is getting from paralysis to flow at those 4 levels. And it happens in order. It happens first at the thought level, then at the feeling level, then at the action level, then at the outcomes of one's actions level. So I'm just doing this kind of translation exercise to kind of see what the framework looks like. But I'm not claiming to know for certain that anything I'm saying is true. I'm just putting it on the table because this is like a brainstorming session,
You know what? I'm going to thank you for that. You know why? Because by going through this exercise multiple times, what Paul put up earlier was observe emotions, thoughts, and solutions. So self-aware, you're observing, right? You're the observer. So you're aware of self. Then you have your thoughts. What you were talking about was trusting. So if you have to trust yourself, you trust your thoughts. Then from there, you have I'm sorry, the second step was trust, which is emotions, right? So you have to regulate your emotions in order to trust yourself. Does that make sense? So the idea of regulating your emotions to trust yourself, then your thoughts are able to be clear because you've regulated your emotions. Or maybe I had that reversed. What do you think?
I would state it this way.
Because the last one would be sensations, which is actually the way you were talking about with self-acceptance. So the sensation of ideas. So that comes back to Paul's 4 categories. But how actually would you map thoughts, I should ask, and emotions? Would you reverse those 2?
So I would thank you for saying what you just said, because it opens up an opportunity for me to rephrase and reframe just a bit. So I would say that in the framework I just laid out a minute ago, the key is, well, they're all key, but here's how to resolve what you're asking. So there's self-awareness of thoughts and feelings. There's self-trust that all of them are okay, as long as I can learn which ones are appropriate to implement in my actions and which ones are not appropriate to implement in my actions, and instead to bring to prayer or meditation or a therapist. But trusting that all of them are okay, as long as I learn that distinction. And then devotion to self-restraint. It's self-restraint. I'm repeating what I said earlier to bounce off it into an answer to your question, Joseph. That self-restraint to avoid the impulse to escape thoughts and feelings, and instead to just learn how to not act on that impulse to escape them, and instead just create a space, a self-disciplined, devoted, self-restraining space for them, is then what enables the next move of accepting all of them in order to move into the next triangle below, which is discerning which thoughts and feelings should be implemented in one's actions versus which ones should be not implemented in one's actions and instead be brought into meditation, prayer, a therapist's room, or a heart-to-heart talk with a good friend, etc. And so does that help sort out how things move from thoughts in the head to actions down in the legwork? through the zone of the feelings, and how that self-restraint creates a vessel in which all thoughts and feelings can be okay, as long as one is in the full practice of learning how to distinguish which ones to implement in actions and which ones to bring elsewhere. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I'm trying to just reconcile the actions and self-acceptance that you were using a little bit earlier. So the how do they reconcile with one another? That's the one I'm just kind of unclear on.
So the self-acceptance is right there, like neurologically in the human neurological system, right in the solar plexus. It both in all three of the systems I mentioned earlier, the Buddhist system, the Hindu system, and the Jewish tree of life system. And that's the place of acceptance of two things. Acceptance on the inside, that I'm thinking what I'm thinking and I'm feeling what I'm feeling, and some of it I should not implement in my actions, but I can still be okay with it on the inside because I got a vessel that's containing it and supporting it. Acceptance of all that on the inside. And then on the outside, acceptance of which thoughts and feelings I should be implementing in my actions. And moving down into the lower triangle of the legwork with all that stuff. So right there in the solar plexus, in the heart chakra, as a yogic person would call it, is that place of acceptance of both. Acceptance of what's going on the inside in terms of thoughts and feelings, all of them, and acceptance of what needs to go on the outside in terms of the subset of thoughts and feelings that should be implemented in actions. And that self-acceptance is, in terms of the three underlying ideas of surrender, trust, and devotion, that's a surrender move. Because acceptance is a form of surrender. So does that help you understand where acceptance and self-acceptance fits into this other set of categories?
Yeah, it helps a lot, actually. I very much. Katie's actually been waiting, I just noticed, for quite a while in the chat. But yeah, it does help a little bit, but I do have maybe a follow-up. But I do want to be respectful of other people as well. Go ahead, Katie.
Your thoughts mapped exactly into what I learned this week. It might be smart, might be informing yourself about what unwanted thoughts are. It might be like, oh, there might be such thing as like a responsibility obsession. You start to like, you observe your own thoughts and you say like, oh, I start to loop around on this a lot. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not real. So then Mike's saying too, but Mike's absolutely right too. Like sometimes a lot of these things might not be a willpower issue alone. Like it might in paralyzing the sense that before maybe you would think it's just something that you have to endure, but now you're more aware that's just something I'm doing. Or, maybe there needs to be like, so it's really going to depend very specific to each, whatever your diagnosis or whatever it is that you're treating. So, but I agree with you, like discerning what's a real threat, what's a unwanted, what's an irrational thought. It's going to be different depending on what you're diagnosing. And then action would be, escaping might be like, people will see it differently in different people. Maybe someone might reach for a drink, someone might reach for an extra cookie to try to like escape those feelings rather than just accepting that either, okay, I'm looping around on this, it's not real, or maybe, maybe that person needs a medication or something like that. And the action might be realizing that you're like, oh, I'm the cause of it, not something out there. Kind of the responsibility thing of understanding, like, well, maybe like they're not doing something. Maybe I'm just overthinking, which I like your paraphrase to obsessing or overthinking. That was fun.
One of the main things that I think that's important here to really kind of consider more than anything is the thought process that we're actually going through and the dialogue that we're having in order to build a model in the first place. I think that's what we're all talking the same language, right? In a way. We're maybe using different concepts to in certain ways to express some of these ideas. But the dialogue that we're actually having is really important, in the sense that if you're trying to get to a fundamental truth about something. So the discussion that we just had, the idea of self-acceptance and outcomes and how they all map together, and was helpful. You know, and I think that it's interesting. And the thing is, again, what you can start to see and appreciate are the models that have been constructed by John and Yoshibi. That the thing that I liked about it so much is that they took a macro approach, and companies adopted their process. And the conversation we're having is trying to figure out how do we get to the most macro level and then get to micro incisive. And the thing that they were actually the tests that they were actually able to usurp, not overtake, were preferenced. The companies preferred them over, or that they were able to was the Myers-Briggs model, which is actually interesting in and of itself, because that is a very, I think, micro kind of way of assessing an organization. And so I think that if you start to, we're looking at this from a macro perspective, then we can drill down to the micro incisive kind of ideas. And if we're talking about this, that some of the concepts that we're just, and you again, you can use this model in a number of different ways to come up with different ways of interacting with each individual, as opposed to interacting with each individual the same way. Where, you know, there's a few different major tests that are used with corporations in order to test personalities, to see how teams are actually going to interact with one another. But in any case, we're thinking about things at a higher level, and what fits underneath those categories. So I think it's exactly what I find to be the most important thing about this discussion in general, is that we keep, you know, kicking back ideas all the way to the idea of consciousness, what we were talking about a little bit earlier with Paul, and seeing how they these ideas map to one another. But so I'm very much appreciative of the dialogue that this has actually created, in addition to the geometrical ideas of thought. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
No, I don't mean to interrupt. Please finish.
I'm done. All right, go ahead.
I want to connect a few things that you just mentioned back to acceptance. So you
Sure.
talked about being able to work with different people differently, instead of trying to work with everyone the same way.
Yeah.
I assume you meant that it's better if one has the skill of working with different individuals differently, depending on what each of those bilateral relationships needs.
Correct.
Okay. So I want to connect that thought back with
or it's actually just seeing how they interact, more or less. I wouldn't say the ability to interact. It's just seeing how those individuals interact. So that's just a minor difference. It's seeing how the parts interact, as opposed to actually seeing yeah, I mean, again, it's looking at the interactions themselves, not necessarily looking at the how they are, a single approach of how they interact, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I can connect to the way you rephrased it. And I want to connect it back to the quote on the meetup page, where Bucky himself is quoted as saying, you know, getting the world to work for 100% of humanity.
Yeah.
Work in that quote seems to be referring to needs, like, so that the needs of 100% of humanity can be met. And I think there's quotes elsewhere on the meetup page about how Bucky seemed to believe that the needs of all of humanity can be met if we get the design problems solved. And so, go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
So this notion of needs and this notion of interactions and seeing how different parts of the whole interact with each other, which I would rephrase as seeing that they interact with each other in the way that they do, because that's the way they need to. And so I'm going to tie this back to self-acceptance. So once one moves along the practice that I described earlier of learning to discern the difference between which of one's plans should be implemented in one's actions versus which of one's thoughts, plans should be not implemented in one's actions and instead taken to meditation or prayer or a therapist or heart-to-heart with a friend, heart-to-heart talk with a friend. That's the moment when that discernment of that difference enables one to accept what one does need to do in one's actions as called for by the situation. And accepting that on its own terms, kind of shorn of the additional baggage that one tends to bring to perceptions of one's own needs and perceptions of others' needs before engaging in this self-awareness practice. Let me rephrase that.
Mm-hmm.
Before engaging in the self-awareness practice, one brings a lot of baggage to one's perceptions of one's own needs for what one thinks one needs to do, and one's perceptions of others' needs and what they need one to do, or what one needs to do for them. But once one moves along this practice of discerning the difference between which thoughts and feelings should be implemented and which ones should not, the baggage is kind of separated out. And not stuffed, it's processed in a way that's healthy and enables it to flow, but it's separated out from one's actions. And at that point, one can accept the needs, one's true needs for what one needs to do in one's actions, whatever it be, at work, with friends, in a marriage, whatever. And one can accept others' needs for what they are, accurately perceived. And that starts to become a vehicle for what Bucky was talking about how once we're seeing things clearly, in a design structure of perception that enables us to see things clearly, we can see needs clearly, and we can see that the needs of 100% of humanity can be met once we solve these design problems. And the part of the design problem that we're talking about now is the internal design of a structure of human perception that enables one to discern these distinctions. So I wanted to connect that too, because you reminded me of that when you talked about seeing the interactions among different pieces, and just adding, this assumption that, well, they're interacting the way that they are because that's what they need to do, or that's what they perceive they need to do.
Perceive. Yeah, that's a great point, is that it's the perception aspect of it. And once that perception is actually maps more to reality, actually allows them to interact, is even as more, because you start to see why needs are here and needs are here and how they need to be met. So the idea that you can change the perspective of individuals, and that's where you start to see the inner relationships that have to occur. And yes, there, I guess, in a sense, there has to be a negotiation to a certain degree, right? If you're talking about the world, I mean, in that sense. But more importantly, I think it's the ability to understand why the other part exists and how they connect to one another. And if you have that, then the whole works better. So that's the the example of how how different groups will interact with one another to understand what their functions are and what their needs are and how they relate to the other person's needs. Groups, anyway. I'll just say groups. And I think that's the awareness that, again, it comes back to being self-aware and taking actions and everything else that we've talked about this evening. So I very much appreciate what you just said. In fact, I would say this comes back to the whole idea of what we're talking about, spherical thinking. versus the idea of linear thinking, right? So everything we just talked about, if we had only thought about it in one particular way, then that wouldn't necessarily work, right? If everybody stayed thinking in having one particular perspective on the world. So it all starts with our perspective, right? I mean, I think I'm understanding this correctly, and I guess you can correct me if not. Any comment or any corrections, shall I say?
No, I agree with your point. The dialogue is helpful because we're translating through different words to underlying realities. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate your bringing into the picture the issue of, different parts of a whole interacting and understanding that and accepting the way that they interact. And when one is negotiating with another person, accepting where they're coming. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think that the reason I can go all night with it, I mean, because again, it started with what you put on the table, right? I mean, that what Paul actually put on the table, and I think what you expanded on, and how we could come back to those ideas, and see again how the nodes interact is the way I like to think about it. Once you have principles that govern how the underlying parts should interact. And that's what we're trying to get to, is a certain set of principles that allow you to make a decision, like to see how the micro-incisive interactions actually relate to one another. So again, I think this is the macro comprehensive, micro incisive that we're going to. So yeah, then once we have the different perspectives, we can kind of see how those map into one another. So
yeah, identifying the words that capture these underlying realities increases the ability to understand each other, and that increases trust, which increases flow. So
language, and it's something that I've actually need to one of the most important parts, and one of the most actually interesting things about Bucky is the complexity of his language, and how he uses certain words that actually are sometimes puzzling, but they're incredibly well thought out once you drill down to the core of what they actually mean. And I think what was important about that is then you get into, that's geometry of thought. It's seeing beyond what was said and seeing how the concepts actually map together, how the concepts map together, not just the words. And so to reality. Anyway, I've had a good time. I mean, with this, because please, Jeannie, go. We've been kind of.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm a little disappointed that no one has grabbed up my model of society as the whirlwind here, and I think it works so well because you can see the inertia of it, that we've gotten so large that this thing spinning around, it's very hard to change society at this point. And if you can imagine, the king sitting in here in the middle, he doesn't change anything at all. You almost have to be on the outside to change things. And this I think is
That's the therapist in the model that we've been talking about, from the perspective, giving us awareness.
You need to be out here somewhere in order to change things, because if you're just being sloshed around by this enormous whirlwind that we're in, it's not going to stop. It's not going to change. You've got to be somehow able to, root yourself or get some footing somewhere on the outside in order to change the society, I think. Does anybody like this this
I like
model
it.
of
You know,
the, of this?
I'm not kidding. I do have a note to actually think about that more deeply. One of the more difficult concepts has been procession for me personally. That's all, and I'm willing to admit that. I think that that's one of the more difficult concepts of Bucky. And if you can grok that, I think then you're much, and I think you've got a better hold on it than I do. So but I very much appreciated your model. Paul, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Do you want to respond, Jeannie? Then like Paul go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that. What did I want to say? That well, I'll let Paul go. Sorry.
No, Jane, I might want to respond to what you're about to say. If you have something, say it. Okay, all right.
I'd like to respond briefly to something Jeannie said, and then defer to you, Paul.
Yeah. Paul, are you okay with that? Or?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a number of things that both Bill and Jeannie and Joe said. So I'll be able to build on whatever you two talk about right now for whatever I'm going to say.
I'll be brief since I've done a lot of talking. Jeannie, I like your model, and I would distinguish between two ways that a person can be on the outside. One way is to be politically on the outside in the sense of having no allies at all and not being a member of any coalition at all.
Right.
It's really hard to change society from the outside with no allies and no coalition. But another way to be on the outside is to be not politically on the outside, but to be analytically on the outside, which is to see things from a different perspective analytically than all those caught in the whirlwind can see them, because they're all caught in the whirlwind and they can't see it from an outside perspective because they're in it. So the history of positive change in humankind for thousands of years has been a story of someone coming along and seeing things from an outside perspective that those caught in the whirlwind at the time couldn't see because they were in the whirlwind. So being on the outside historically has been important, being analytically on the outside. And then what happens from there is once the person has an outside perspective that they see a positive change that could happen that would bring benefit to a large number of people, then they start the coalition building process by gaining allies, by translating their outside perspective into terms of benefit that build a coalition. And then their coalition grows. And then what is an outside set of ideas starts to insert into the society in ways that shift the balance because their coalition of this set of outside ideas is growing and its relative power is increasing, and then you get change. So yeah, it's a great model. So I'll stop there.
I'm just going to interject 1 minute and let Paul go, but that is a great analogy. I mean, that is perfect. That is the idea of potential, the relationships, and the actions right there. That is the tetramine process. So I mean, it's good to hear it from that perspective as to how change occurs, how change can happen. Again, we're putting words to very deep concepts. Paul, all right, I interrupted him.
Yeah, I want to just try to bring back some of these things to wrap them around the tetrahedron and Bucky in a little closer way. One being, Katie made a point about the feeling thought thing can go either direction, but I think there's an even bigger point there that it might be better for neuroscientists to think more about, and maybe, I don't know if you go back through the Buddhist traditions, but by the way, I don't know if you were there at the beginning of what I talked about, Bill, when I first talked about DBT, but did you hear that Marsha Linehan we're reverse engineering her concepts back to Buddhism, but her concepts came from Buddhism by her own admission. She was trained with Thich Nhat Hanh. She brought her Zen Buddhist salvation from her suicidality to Western psychotherapy. So you're just reverse engineering back, but it's not a coincidence. So we shouldn't go, oh, fundamental concepts that everyone discovered independently. Not at all. She took Zen Buddhism and brought it to Western psychotherapy. Let's just be clear on that. That's what she will tell you. But so you're just doing a good job of showing that. But which is not just, that's great. But secondly,
wait, hold. The reason that multiple different people arrive at the same basic ideas is because the underlying reality that's driving them to their discoveries is a single reality.
I agree with you, but you can't use this as an example of that, because it would be like, oh, Jesus came up with X, Y, and Z, but then we learn that the master of the Bhagavad Gita sat with him for 5 years. That's what happened with Marshall Linehan. So watch out. But that's all I'm saying. It's not that important. But secondly, this order of events thing. I love the tetrahedron because you can decide, once you have 4 points that you've decided are valuable to map into it, what flow to use, because the models of how a thought precedes a feeling, precedes an action are flawed, seriously. Late neuroscience. Joe, don't you think we should bring in Ian McGilchrist, the master and his emissary, to this? He completely threw all that on its head in a beautiful book. And he actually says it's a handoff from the right holistic brain to the left and then back. But the master should be the right. But I want to tie this to Jeannie and ask Bucky that I think Bucky would have loved that if he would have been alive to see it, because that whirlwind is a result of the left brain being in charge, okay? And it can't get out of its whirlwind by itself. And Ian McGilchrist's solution is that we should all be writing poems, doing art, listening to great music, so our right brain wakes up again, because it's been anesthetized by its de-emphasis. So I just thought that was important, and I'd like to think about how Bucky would think about to bring into this. So apply the tetrahedron to non-ordered events in the mind and body. Also, that a sensation, sometimes it's been shown with fight or flight that you act before your conscious mind has the thought. There's a neural, it is going up into that, one section of the brain, but it doesn't reach consciousness, and you hit the tiger. That's been proven. So you got to really look again and think about non-ordered events and watch them flow around the points of the tetrahedron. It's beautiful. There's my thought.
That is, and I very much appreciate the McGilchrist and analogy. That was very good. That was very well done. I like that a lot. And it kind of gets back to what Bill was even mentioning a little bit earlier, was the right brain, left brain interactions that he was talking about. But that thought process that you just mentioned brings it to a new level. And I think, again, this is coming up with the idea, the concepts that fit underneath. What you just explained are the details of how the interactions happen underneath those right and left brain functions. And again, those are the interactions that tell you that how to come up with an optimal answer, whatever that may be, for whatever model you may be using. So, I think that's excellent. Thank you, Paul. I very much, and that, how the nodes connect. That's essentially what you just explained beautifully. So, I had a really good time this evening. I thought that this was a very productive evening. I appreciated everybody's input. It started with Evanik and spherical thinking. And how, even coming back to what Shrupi had talked about with the four eyes. If anybody knows what that is, essentially is it's seeing it's seeing the problem from multiple perspectives. And that's where we began the evening, and then we went to Jeannie's beautiful presentation on how the tetrahedron and the nodes, the points interact, and how we can get actually stuck in a way, only doing the same thing over and over. If you mentioned, I remember you saying that specifically at the point of the top of the tetrahedron. And if we're making the same decisions, the same mistakes over and over. Then we had Paul come in and really provide us with a model that just sparked an incredible amount of discussion for the whole evening. That to see how all these ideas interact and how the spiral can come into that. And again, the spiral are the interactions that we keep going down deeper into. So, and that comes back to what Paul just used as an example with the thoughts. This is a lot of fun to me. So I appreciate people actually spending the time to do it. And I think that's fundamentally what we have to be grateful for each individual that shows up here every Sunday night doing a presentation for 45 minutes and giving us new ideas and new ways to think about things. And ultimately, we have CJ to thank for that. And all these interactions wouldn't happen without him. So with that, I don't know if anybody wants to add anything. Feel free.
Just thanks, everyone. I'm going to watch the video. I'm sorry I was late because I didn't see the first presentation, so I'm going to watch them later.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would. Strupi's was actually the first presenter here out of all the presenters, and he's pretty mind blowing. Not to say that everybody else isn't. Everybody is, but his spherical thinking and the four eyes actually really will. It really is. It's an aha moment where you start to understand the importance of multiple perspectives and multiple disciplinary approaches. Yeah, and yeah, I just I enjoyed that quite a bit. So that's where everything started, and I would definitely go back and take a look, and I would take a look at Strupi's presentation too if you haven't necessarily seen those. So, Jeannie, would you like to add anything? Bill, would you like to add anything? Yeah, Jeannie.
Sorry, I can't do the chat, but I did want to say that procession can be kind of compared to martial arts, where you're using the person's own forces, to let them, fall over themselves. And the great thing about procession really is that it's a promise of that we can make change, and it might not have to be so hard, that you can somehow harness the forces that are already existing to make the changes that you want to exist, being strategic, and it might be easier than we think. That's the hope.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm just going to compare it really quickly to someplace where I work. It's very big. It's the Department of Defense, so you can imagine what that's like. There are solutions all over the place. And the idea that you have to solve it with something big or new is really just a misperception of reality, in the sense that you just have to make little changes within the existing system in order to have a big impact, by utilizing the resources that are already there, as opposed to actually reinventing the wheel. That's the one thing I've noticed about the organization once it becomes separated, is that all of a sudden people are coming up with their own solutions, and they're not necessarily relating to one another. So that's the example where they're not necessarily making the connections. But you're right, they don't have to be big changes. And trim tab is the micro part of the micro example of that. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I could give you actually 10 examples off the top of my head how there are solutions that are literally laying around where I work. And actually I can give you examples where people have tried to come up with big solutions in the past where I've worked, or not, or clients anyway, but where they've tried to come up with big solutions, and it has actually ended up making the problem a lot more worse. So look at it this way: you have to look inside to go outside. That's one way of looking at it, and that's the transformation we were talking about a little bit earlier. Again, Jeannie, thank you. Bill, thank you. Anybody else thank you. And Katie, thank you. Mike as well. Obviously, you've made some comments as well. And everybody that's willing to listen, I appreciate you being here. So with that, if everybody's good, I'm going to close it out. Well, everybody have a wonderful evening.
Good night, Joe. Thank you, Joe, for moderating.
No, I mean,
Hey.
I'm going to be honest. This is a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Well, still, we appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate everyone here. Good night.